Thank you, Professor Mac Ginty. We can start slowly. Dear colleagues, today we have second lecture, and the topic of our lecture will be peacebuilding and its current trends. And today we have Professor Roger Mac Ginty from the Durham University. He is actually well known in our community about with his everyday peace indicators because as you know, UNDP had a finance project on this topic, and uh, Natia and Katie were also involved in this. So I'm happy that today we can listen to Professor directly. And the format will be the same, around 40 minutes of, let's say, direct talk, and then Q&A for another half an hour, 40 minutes. So I will try to keep the time. So thank you, Professor, and floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak. I know there's a lot of expertise in the room. I know there's a lot of practitioner expertise in the room, and probably many of the things that I will say will be very familiar to you from your work and from your thinking. I'm going to talk mainly about the global situation and its impact on peace building. And many of my reflections come from interviews I conducted last summer. I interviewed 30 senior peacemakers or mediators, and much of what I say is a reflection of what they said. And some of my thinking comes from everyday peace indicators, which Vano mentioned. And everyday peace indicators is a methodology that myself and someone else developed to crowdsource or community source what peace or safety or security or reconciliation means to people in their everyday lives. So not what experts or outsiders mean, but what local communities mean. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to share my screen, and as Vano said, I'll talk for about 50 minutes, and
It's on
then
the screen. It's on the screen. Thank you.
good, and then we can have questions. So let's begin with what peace building means, or it might be thought to mean. And according to John Paul Lederach, who's probably the most famous and influential scholar and practitioner of peace building, its processes, approaches, and stages needed to transform conflict towards sustainable, peaceful relationships. So that, in a sense, is quite straightforward, but there are all sorts of questions that arise from this. So a key question is, well, who should the peace builders be? The state, outsiders, insiders, sub-state? And of course, if it's sub-state in a divided society, well, who are the peace builders going to be? Are they from one group or from another group? And then the question is, well, what would the peace builders do? What is the objective? Is it stabilization? Is it something more ambitious? Is it coexistence? Or is it reconciliation? And there's a big difference between stabilization and reconciliation. Or should there be a specialist focus? Should this peace building focus on particular communities, particular areas? Should it focus on youth or on women or a particular topic. And then when should this peace building take place? When the term and practice of peace building began in the modern era in the 1990s, it was often described as post-conflict peace building. So it happens after the shooting stops. But of course, we know that many conflicts are very long running, and we can't wait until the conflict stops. So increasingly, peace building happens during conflict, not after, because there is no after conflict very often. And then how is this peace building done? And often it's done through projects and programs, which leads to the issue of, well, how do we join these projects and programs up to be something more than islands? How can these islands be something that is joined together? And then why do we do this? Is it to make us feel better? Is it for reputation reasons? Is it, in a sense, what is the end goal? And then if those questions aren't difficult enough, there are other questions as well, such as, does this actually work? And how would we know it works? Are our monitoring and evaluation techniques good enough to capture how it works? And certainly it's very common for politicians and some policymakers to be very dismissive of peace building. They say, well, we can't measure it. Why should we spend money on something we cannot see, that we cannot see results coming back? Recently, I was at a conference and someone who was very senior in a foreign ministry in a European country referred to peace building as that fuzzy stuff, that feel-good stuff. And he was very dismissive because, how do I know this works? And can we point to examples of success in which we can definitively say, things are better because of peace building? So those are very difficult questions, and those of us who are interested in peace building have to work hard to answer those questions, to say, yes, we can have metrics that measure peace building. We can point to examples in which there has been improvement. So for the rest of this lecture, I want to talk about key trends in peace building. I want to talk about the peace building landscape. And there are 4 key trends that I want to discuss. The first one is the fragmentation of the rules-based international order. The second is the emergence of new or non-Western peace actors. The third is the remnants of the liberal peace or a hybrid system. And the fourth are the impacts of the local turn in peace building and the rise of peace tech. So I'll discuss all of these and explain what I mean. But before doing that, it's worth saying that most of the trends that I'm talking about started before US President Trump took office in January of this year. There's a tendency that we blame everything on Trump, but actually many of these trends were already happening. So the first trend that I want to talk about is the fragmentation of the rules-based international order. And it's worth pointing out that this rules-based international order only worked for some people. For many, it was unfair. It did not bring benefits to them. And what we've seen over the past 20 years has been fatigue amongst liberal peace actors. The United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, they invested heavily in Sierra Leone, Liberia, the former Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and really they have very little to show for it. They expended blood and treasure, and they got very little back. So they're quite tired of that. We see the rise of alternative peacemakers, which I will discuss later. But what has happened is that the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union is less and less interested in peace. So they have left the field of play. And nature dislikes a vacuum. So other actors have taken that place. And we also see the greater prominence of seemingly insurmountable transnational challenges. So things like migration, climate change, or even basic demographics, where some countries are not reproducing their population and they face an existential threat. So at the outset, I mentioned that I interviewed 30 senior peace builders and mediators. And here are some quotations from them. One said, following the standard liberal peace recipe in Iraq and Afghanistan did not work. Setting up shell governments in Iraq and South Sudan does not work. And it's interesting because I asked these 30 peace builders and mediators, what works? And everyone told me what didn't work. And I said, no. What works? And they continued to tell me what didn't work. And then on the third occasion, they told me what worked. Another one of them said, a version of a liberal-looking state seemed to be the end goal. And now that does not seem to be viable. So what is it that you're trying to build? So there's a crisis of confidence amongst some peace builders about what they want to build, what the outcome should be. Another said, the big change is the decline of Western powers and their economic and military power in comparison to others. 20 years ago, we did not have the active engagement of Russia, China, Turkey, or the Gulf countries. We have no framework. The West is not a predominant political or military power anymore. There are a lot of other powerful actors asserting themselves in the conflicts we work in. And another said, African countries are fed up with Western peacemaking. There is this binary of the West and the rest. The rest doesn't want to play the game anymore. So that's one part of these four trends. And that is that the established system of peacemaking is under threat, is fragmenting. And then we have the second major trend, which is the rise of alternative peacemakers. So UAE, the United Arab Emirates is a broker for major prisoner exchanges between Ukraine and Russia. These are high number prisoner exchanges that have been happening on a monthly basis. Qatar, as we know, mediates between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah, and has also been helping Iran in negotiations. Oman has been providing space for talks between the US and Iran. Turkey, again, is providing space for Russia and Ukraine to talk. China has presented itself as a mediator in a number of conflicts. It is quite a significant contributor to UN peacekeeping missions. It contributes about 1,800 troops to UN peacekeeping missions. The United States contributes 27. China and Brazil have come up with a peace plan for Ukraine and Russia. And 2 summers ago, African leaders sent a delegation to Kyiv and Moscow to try to see if there could be a resolution to the Russian-Ukraine war. So what we're seeing is a new prominence of these actors. Actors like Qatar have been engaged in mediation for very many years, but they're newly prominent, more noticeable now. But also we have the remnants of international order. We still have international humanitarian law. It is respected very selectively, as we can see with Gaza at the moment, but it is still there. We still have a United Nations. Quite amazingly, it still exists. It's unloved. It is often ignored, but it feeds and houses and protects millions of people on the planet every day. We still have INGOs, some of them large, ambitious, and active. We still have a diplomatic system. And we still have commercial law and trading systems to allow international exchange of goods and services. So what we have is simultaneously the international order is fragmenting, but parts of it are still clinging on. And then we have some quotations. One person said, bottom-up driven versions of peacebuilding have appealing features, but unless you include political elites, it is fundamentally flawed. And this is, I think, one of the problems facing peacebuilding, and it's the problem of power, that very often those involved in peacebuilding do not have the power. The picture is from an everyday peace indicators exercise that we carried out in Colombia.
Excuse me, Professor, please continue.
So the picture is from Colombia. We were carrying out an everyday peace indicators exercise, and the dog wandered in and just sat down, and it makes for a nice picture. Another interviewee said, the machinery of the liberal peace rewards those in power and destroys indigenous movements. And then we've seen the local turn in peacebuilding. I saw this picture of a female represented on a street sign in Sweden, and it struck me that I had never seen. Uh, it's always a man walking, but so it was worth a picture. But we've heard of the local turn, and the idea behind localization of peace building and development is that local participation and ownership enhances the sustainability of peace initiatives. The idea is that if local people feel involved, feel consulted, then they will have ownership of peace building or development or reconciliation. It's not clear to me if local actors were genuine, if international actors were genuine about the local turn, about involving local communities. Localization can place a burden on local actors. And it's worth asking if communities really own projects that are funded and initiated overseas. Yet, the local turn is a real thing. We've seen very significant resources invested locally by international organizations and international non-governmental organizations. It's worth asking what works. If we think about peace building, what actually works? Because it's very easy to be critical. It's very easy to identify what does not work. But what actually works? Well, long-term networks. That is, people from civil society who are in contact across divisions on a long-term basis. And I know that many of you in this room are members of networks or groups in which people have been in contact for the long term. And often these networks are dormant or they do not deliver results. But then when they are needed, they can deliver results. And these are often very long term. They last decades. They involve commitment. They involve working on joint language, on joint documents, or simply having lines of communication that stay open during times of tension or times of conflict. Also, what works are influencers. Now, I don't mean social media influencers. I don't mean TikTok or Instagram or whatever. I'm sure that is important. But what I mean are people who can talk to political leaders. So often political leaders are very busy. They don't want to be seen to be involved in peace or reconciliation, but they have advisors. They have people they listen to. And that's what I mean by influencers, that it's important that peace builders can talk to the influencers and the influencers can talk to political leaders or militant leaders or people in an inner circle of government. Really important are self-starting individuals, and we can see them in every community. These are people who have charisma, people who dedicate time to the community, people with broad shoulders, people who can take criticism from within their own community. These are social entrepreneurs. They often work in business or the community, and they're the people who show up and keep showing up. They're not necessarily peace-building organizations. Instead, they're peace-building people or individuals. Also, what works is not using the word peace or reconciliation, because we know that that turns a lot of people off. They're either very tired of hearing those words or they're suspicious of those words. Again, not approaching peace directly. You know, if you set up a club and say, hey, this is going to be a peace club, no one's going to come. But if you set up a judo club or a karate club, then people from different communities might come. Or if you set up a business, people might trade with you. And that is a way of people talking, of people seeing each other as human beings. You don't talk about peace, but indirectly, you're actually doing peace. And for me, the major peace building organizations on the planet are families. Families are where we get our moral compass. Families are where we learn the difference between right and wrong. Families are where there is de-radicalization. Because when you think about it, families are a space of education, a space of negotiation. And this is where grandmothers calm grandsons. This is a place where aunts and uncles calm children or young adults. They teach them about the language to use, about how to get out of difficult situations. And I think as peace builders, we probably don't pay enough attention to families as being the most important political unit on the planet. And also, I've noticed there is an age and stage element to peace building, in which, certainly in Northern Ireland, where I come from, if I look around communities, I see that very often it is when people reach their 40s and 50s that they become engaged in community activity. By that stage, they're established in their career and their kids are a bit older or perhaps have left. So they've got a bit more time, but they also have confidence to accept criticism from their own community, to face criticism from outside communities as well. We're also in an era of a digital revolution, and there is a lot of talk about peace tech. And I think we still have to ask, what is this bringing to the table? What is this doing that is an advantage, that has added value? Sure, peace tech can produce very nice visualizations. It can interrogate large amounts of data. But ultimately, peace is a human activity. It involves patience. It involves bravery. It involves people-to-people activities. And if technology can help, great. But let's be careful about how many resources we devote to technology, because it is very greedy in terms of resources. So I'm coming towards an end. Let's ask big questions about the peace landscape. One of my interviewees said, there is disagreement on the ambition of what peace is. It is increasingly diverse and complicated. And I think that's true. We've got a fragmentation of the peace building world. We've got very many potential mediators, and the scene, the landscape is quite crowded. And what we see in a number of cases is that conflict actors go mediator shopping. They're trying to get the best deal. And rather than two conflict parties and one mediator, there might be multiple mediators. And it's very difficult to reach agreement if there are very many actors involved. We also have to ask questions to Qatar or the UAE or other countries who are engaged in mediation. Yes, they facilitate the exchange of prisoners, and that is very good. That is saving lives and improving lives. But is there anything more? Is the exchange of prisoners linked to a peace process, a political process that will bring a halt to conflict? Is this mediation conducted by the Gulf countries more than humanitarianism? And I think the reason I ask this question is because I remember the 1990s, in which there were peace processes, in which wars were stopped and new constitutions and new ways of doing politics were introduced. Those were much more than humanitarian processes. They were political processes. They were peace processes that were ambitious, that were comprehensive. The last major peace accord was in Colombia in 2016. It's worth asking if we're in a post-peace process era in which there are not comprehensive peace accords anymore. There are just ceasefires and humanitarian interventions. Another quotation from who said, conflict actors are working hard to avoid being cornered into peace negotiations, certainly of the type we had in the 1990s. The contemporary international environment gives them resources. In other words, we've moved on from the 1990s, or at least conflict actors have moved on. But much of the peace-building repertoire is from the 1990s. Much of the language that peace builders use, many of the techniques that they use, seem to be stuck in the 1990s. And maybe we need to reevaluate what peace building means in a changing environment. And it's worth asking if we can think about Western and non-Western peace actors working together. They seem to act independently of one another. It's worth asking if they can collaborate, if they can maximize their own strengths. It's worth asking, is there, given that we are in a stage of flux, we're in a stage of fragmentation, it's worth asking, is this an emerging system? And if it is a system, what does peace look like in this system? Is it just a ceasefire? Or is it something more? Can we strive for more than stabilizing the patient towards making the patient feel better, bringing them on a journey of recovery? So we're in at a really exciting stage as peace builders in which the landscape of peace and conflict is changing. The funding landscape, the organizational landscape is changing. And it's an exciting time, but also a time with things to concern us and make us quite worried. So thank you for your patience, and thank you very much to Maria, who has been no doubt struggling with my accent. So thank you. Let's have a discussion. I look forward to that.
Thank you, Professor. That was very interesting. Lots of insightful observations and uh, comments. So we are open to questions, dear colleagues. Um, we have first who is Merab. So please, Merab, and maybe we collect a couple of them, and then you can answer Professor together. Maybe two or three of them.
Yeah,
Please.
thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and the analysis. You mentioned that it didn't come overnight, but it started some time ago. So when exactly was it Brexit, or was it earlier when you see the signs of changing order? And thank you.
Thank you, Merab. If you can lower your hand, that would help others. Please, colleagues. If not, I do have my own. And my question would be, basically, we see a lot of, we see this trend of the overdose with the geopolitics at the moment in peacemaking, peace building, in this part of the world, especially because we live here, we work here, and a lot of geopolitics today because of war in Ukraine, Trump, and so on, NATO, and so on and so on. So is this somehow a normal, just like is this the cycle in kind of the peace building kind of domain to have these parts like from global to local and then vice versa, or is it a deliberate thing somehow for the um, about political elites? And can we do something about it? Is it still a solution to continue working on the local level, or should we somehow try to get the sense what's happening on the bigger level? So thank you for this, and maybe if you could answer because that's a lot of kind of general questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting questions. Mira, when did the trends start? There isn't a precise moment. Many organizations and countries that have been involved in peace building have been on a constant learning journey, but a key moment was 9/11, which justified moving from negotiated outcomes towards outcomes of victory or authoritarianism. Not every country followed the US track after 9/11, but to me, that was a key moment in which at least Western leaders talked about human rights and democracy much less after 9/11 than they did beforehand. It's quite interesting if you look at speeches by Bill Clinton in the 1990s, he's talking constantly about democracy and human rights. Joe Biden did not talk about democracy and human rights. It was about stabilization. It was about security. There's been a long trend towards securitization. Certainly the United Kingdom and the United States lost a lot of energy, a lot of equipment, and a lot of people in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they did not see any return. And there has been a shift, as we can see, towards right-wing politics in many European, North American, and Latin American countries, with populism, nativism, and nationalism, all of which makes the world smaller, all of which is not contributing to a global peace infrastructure or a global peace system. Also, as you know, as Vano has just mentioned, in Europe, Ukraine has been a game changer, and therefore we've seen the securitization of everything. Everything is looked at through a security lens rather than a peace lens. Defense budgets are increasing, often at the cost of development budgets or peace budgets. We've seen Sweden and Finland join NATO. A really important shift happened a few months ago, and that was that Poland and the Baltic countries withdrew from the Ottawa Convention. Now, the Ottawa Convention bans anti-personnel landmines. And this has been in place from the 1990s. So we can't look westwards always and blame the United States. Within the European Union, within the center of Europe, countries are moving away from this international order, this rules-based order. So there isn't a definitive moment, but 9/11 was important on the road, the rise of China, and therefore a new superpower has been important, and Ukraine has been important in all of this. Vano, your question is one that I think we're all struggling with, and this seems to be a moment in which geopolitics is particularly important. We have instability in the United States, or unpredictability. We have a European Union that lacks confidence, and we have a rising China. We have transnational global problems, climate change, demographics, migration, etc. And I think what is somewhat different about geopolitics at the moment as opposed to geopolitics 30 years ago or 40 years ago is that a lot of things seem to be happening at the one time. And also there seems to be an acceleration. Things seem to be happening very quickly. And all of this does filter down locally. And of course, we know about global changes instantaneously because of these. We wake up each morning, or at least I do, and check my phone to see what Donald Trump has said overnight. And that seems to set the tone or the mood for the day. But I think part of the local turn was a realization that political leaders weren't going to listen to peace builders, or they would listen, but just a little. They really hadn't bought peace building. And I think the local turn from many peace builders was a realization that we cannot change capital city dynamics. We cannot change the outcome of an election, but we can attempt to change life in communities. We can, build or contribute to building a sports center, or we can get kids to play together. We can build a play park, and kids from different communities can at least be exposed to one another, to different cultures and different languages. So I think the local turn was actually quite a sensible reaction. And from research I've done in Northern Ireland and Colombia and Lebanon, what we see is these local change makers, these social entrepreneurs. And I suspect that there are many in this room, people who make a difference locally, people whose doors are open rather than closed, people who see possibility, people with enthusiasm and energy. And they act locally, and they are change makers. They do change the mood in society. And I think there's been too much emphasis in peace building about factoring up, about concentrating on, that project worked. I wonder if we can factor it up. The world doesn't really work that way. And what we're seeing and what actually works is factoring out. This horizontal spread in which one community sees another community and thinks, oh, that project worked. Things seem to have calmed down in that community, or relations between groups seem to be better. I wonder if we could imitate that. I wonder if we could do that. So I think there is organically much more horizontal spread of peace building than a sort of top-down, bottom-up dynamic.
Thank you. This is extremely interesting, this point of view, because, yeah, I mean, we are also in the process of rethinking our approaches in our work, and it definitely makes sense, what you're saying. Maybe more questions, dear colleagues, even comments, observations. Guli, Magradze, yeah, please. Please turn on your microphone. You're muted.
Now it's
Miss,
okay?
miss. Yeah.
It's okay. Thank you for good presentation and very interesting and very also complicated things. My question is that we are used to this slogan, no justice, no peace. Yeah. But when we are talking about some countries who may be like intermediate in peace process, there is no justice. I think this Arabian country, or they have some kind of justice, but not human rights, not democracy. And the question is maybe there is time for only security, and human rights and democracy are some far away. And this give some government open that free them to make some not democratic efforts, but say that security first. How do you think the security first really? Maybe security first is first, but where is the place of peace building in this case? I understand that when you say that we now cannot make pretense that we can change full world or something like this, peace builder, but we can do our local things. Okay, local things in local peace we can do, but till we go to the barrier where some political wills of official structure exist. So how work is the situation? Thank you. What
Thank
we
you,
can do
Professor.
really? Mhm.
Thank you, Professor Magradze. More questions, colleagues? More comments, observations? Yeah, Okay, please, Professor Mac Ginty. Yeah, and then maybe there are more questions afterwards.
I think that's a great question, Guli. This balance between peace and justice is always going to be with us. There is no way out of this conundrum, out of this puzzle. I think it's worth asking how much justice and how much peace. In other words, what would this balance look like? We do need security. We do need peace cannot happen, particularly at the local level, if people do not feel safe. If people do not feel safe to go to the shop, to bring their grandmother to the doctor's office, that is not peace. So we do need a minimal level of security, or a minimum level of security. The difficulty is, what is that minimum level? Because often it means empowering police forces, empowering militaries, empowering the security apparatus of the state. No police commissioner, no police commander has ever said, we have enough law. No police commander has ever said, we have enough resources. We don't need anything else. So they always can make a case for more resources and more laws. I think what is important, and we are losing this battle in many, many countries, is that we need to take security seriously, but not too seriously. So I was in Sweden 2 weeks ago. Sweden has joined NATO. Sweden has mobilized its population. They go on military exercises. And I said, in a room full of Swedes, you know, Russia is a menace. Russia has invaded Ukraine, but it is not going to invade Sweden. You need to look at the security situation objectively. And I think what we're seeing on the planet at the moment is, particularly European countries, are talking up war, talking about going on a war footing, new defense expenditure, massive defense expenditure. And I think what peace builders need to do is say, we need an honest security analysis. And what we're seeing at the moment is that defense budgets are being increased, but no one is doing a security analysis. And if they do a security analysis, that security analysis is not gendered. It's not linked to development goals. It's not linked to education or health. Security is seen in an 18th century way about defending borders. Well, let's think about the threats that we face. Pandemics. Borders didn't really matter. Global warming doesn't really stop at borders. The massive migration we see on the planet shows us that many people on the planet don't really care about borders. So I think our job, or part of our job, is in debate, is to say, yeah, we need to take security seriously, but we also need to take health and education and development and community seriously. And what's very noticeable is that this is very male. All of these wars seem to be very male and don't respect gender, don't respect majorities. So I think we really need to get into those debates. And one thing that I've noticed in Europe is that post-Ukraine war, it's very difficult to talk about peace. It's very difficult to, it's, you know, it's perfectly possible to be critical of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as I am. Russia is the aggressor, but also say there needs to be some form of negotiation. There needs to be some form, you know, this meat grinder of young men really is not the answer. Fighting to the last Ukrainian is not the answer. And I know that Ukrainians find that very offensive. And I know that you're in a very sensitive part of the world. But many people who talk about peace have been silenced in the last 3 years. And I think that is unhealthy for our planet.
Thank you. More questions, dear colleagues, or comments? Hamza, please.
Hello, Professor Mac Ginty. It was a very interesting presentation. Thank you for that. And it touched me a lot. It resonated with me a lot, especially that in the era of frustration with peace-building efforts, actors, the peace builders, or projects, or practitioners, or people who work with peace and who work on peace, through peace and for peace, they are frustrated also. And I wanted to ask you about this local turn and about long-term networks, because sometimes the only result we have through numerous peace-building efforts is that there are just networks which may not fight for peace, which may not be vocal against the abusive governments, which may not be open about whatever peace-building initiatives they're doing and whatever they're doing with their cross-border mates. So all this may be under radar, all this may be very quiet, nobody can talk about it. Media will never take these small successes into small interpersonal successes to community or society level. So can you what to do when the only success you have is that just network is there? Can you tell us, can you give us some hope that this is still enough?
So I said that last year I interviewed 30 senior mediators and peacemakers. These were people who had worked in this sector for at least 20 years, many in multiple countries. The number one, when I said what works, and they told me what didn't work, and eventually we got to what works, the number one thing that worked was long-term networks and platforms. Virtually everyone mentioned that. They said that 99% of the time they do not deliver, but it's that 1% in which suddenly the time is right that they do deliver. Now, these are not exciting. These are, they're not noticed. They're like the table in your kitchen at home. You don't notice the table in your kitchen at home, but it's very useful. And if it was not there, you would, hey, where's my table? But you don't notice it. You don't look at it, you just use it. So these networks are part of the furniture, the infrastructure. They're essential for communication across lines. And often the networks are in place and then there is a disruption, such as an election, which means that, in a sense, the wrong people are in the network It also depends what the network does. And I think one of the things that networks can do is they can be future orientated. So it's about the mindset of the network to think about the future. Because, when parties to a conflict come together, they often will talk about the past and grievance. And, that's understandable. But if they're future orientated, I think that changes the mindset. Whether we're talking at the elite level or the local level, it's worth asking, what could this community look like in 5 years' time? You can't plan for more than 5 years, but, how could we make things better? Also, working on common language and common documents. So I think very often in disputes, people have separate documents and they become very wedded to the document. But if you work on the same document, whether it's a Google Doc or whether it's, pen and paper, you're actually engaged in a conversation and you're engaged in a common task. So I think these networks are very important. And some of them have to be secret. Some of them you don't celebrate because they're secret. It they, possibly for security and safety reasons, but often for political reasons, actors want to keep their membership of networks quiet. And that's okay, as long as they deliver and they do their work. So I really think they're important. And, I actually think it's the most important tool that peace builders have is lines of communication and keeping those open. And it involves bravery and energy and inventiveness.
Thank you so much. Uh, any more questions there, colleagues? We can take one or two before we finish up. If not, then maybe last question from my side, Professor. So, in the local turn section, you talked about the influencers, which you kind of rightly described. You do not mean the social media people. This is the kind of yeah, not only our observation, but I think it happens everywhere. It's in a like postmodern world that the respected and respectful leaders and authorities in its positive sense are kind of diminishing. How does that affect, let's say, the peace mediation, peace building process on a practical way? Because if you do not have a respectful leader in the community, for example, on a like national level, is that a good thing or actually a worse kind of puts you in a worse situation?
I think that's a very difficult question because we do see these leaders, obviously Trump, but very, very many others who engage in practices of humiliation, public humiliation, who have a public persona of always being right, of never backing down. And I think a lot depends on whether political leaders also have a personal persona as well as the public persona. So, for example, Margaret Thatcher, who was the leader of the United Kingdom in the 1980s and early 1990s, was known as the Iron Lady, but she never backed down. Her public persona was very strong. But actually, she allowed negotiations, secret negotiations, between her government and the Irish Republican Army, the militant pro-United Ireland group. So there was a difference between her public and her personal persona. And I think, you know, the key question is, are these political leaders open to reason? Do they have quiet moments of reflection? Can their kitchen cabinet, can their inner circle contain influencers who can say, you know, maybe there is a different way, or maybe we can approach this problem using different language. So it's a difficult one, but we're seeing a trend of political leaders who are super people, who, you know, are never wrong. And it's let's hope that some of them have quiet moments of reflection.
Thank you. Mira, please.
Yeah, Professor, you mentioned also these new actors from the East or some other countries. So for the bottom-up level, from the practitioner's point of view, is it kind of safe to accept their offerings to continue what we're doing normally? Because we assume that it could be different, or it could be some hidden whatever threats or risks because we struggle sometimes, or in most cases, with sustainability. There's a good project, it ends up people want more, but you can do it, especially in the current conditions, and from this fatigue from the West. So if there are any data or any analysis of, we briefly may know how they expand with this bribing the governments and getting lithium mines in Africa, but this feels a little bit different. So what would be their interests, and how to avoid some trips maybe, and if it's acceptable or if it's worth considering their possible offerings. We haven't got any, but we're still looking at this. Might be looking. Thank you.
I think it is sensible to look east, because these often are actors who are interested. They sometimes have funding, and often they have access. And, you know, if you're a mediator without access, you're not a mediator. And often they have. Now, when we think about, say, the past 30 years of peace building, we've seen task expansion. We've seen the task of peace building expanding. So peace building becomes development, and development becomes peace building. And in that, there have been very many projects and programs. And I'm sure some of you have been involved in those. Now, clearly, these peace actors from the East have less emphasis, if any emphasis, on issues of democratization. They tend not to use the language of rights or human rights. They are particularly interested in elite agreements between elites. At the same time, if you look at all of those countries, whether it's China or Qatar or Turkey, they have been engaged in remarkable processes of economic development and social development and education. So my sense is that, you know, if you would talk to them about rights or elections, they're not interested. But if you talk to them about education, and even about issues of gender, but phrase that carefully. So in the Gulf countries, not women's empowerment, but it's perfectly fine to talk about girls' education. I think if you get the language right and emphasize development, then they would be interested, but they tend to, I need to put this diplomatically, they tend to be nervous of things that are expressed in very political ways. But development, education, Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have reached kind of the end of our time, and I want to thank you a lot, dear Professor Mac Ginty, for joining, for your very interesting and kind of different in a way that like what we are used to, kind of, this with the discussions and kind of broader point of view on the ongoing trends in the peace building and the great conversations that we had. And I hope that maybe we'll have the opportunity to kind of meet for a longer time period, either in Georgia or somewhere else. So thank you so much. And we will try to be in touch, stay in touch, and thanks a lot and good luck in your research and teaching. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you
Thank
for
you.
your
Thank you,
patience. I
colleagues, for
appreciate it
joining us.
very much. And thank you very much to Maria, the translator. She worked hard. Have a good day.
Great.